That morning, the air was calm, the kind of quiet that made the rustling of autumn leaves sound like a song. Along a cobblestone-lined street in a quiet corner of Asheville, North Carolina, nestled between an old vinyl record store and a family-owned flower shop, sat a little cafe called Fern and Sons. Its brick exterior was covered in ivy, and the windows always seemed to glow with a soft golden light, even on cloudy days. This was Mallory James's favorite place. At 37, she had found comfort in routine, grading student essays, reading poetry collections no one else cared about, and sipping chamomile tea while watching the world go by. But today wasn't about literature. Today, she was there because her older sister insisted she go on one date. One blind date. Just one. He's a normal guy, her sister had said. Polite. Just safe. Mallory didn't believe in safe anymore. Safe sounded boring. But boring sounded better than betrayal. She walked into the cafe at exactly 10 a.m. Her light brown hair was pulled into a casual knot, and a soft tan scarf was wrapped around her neck. As she scanned the room, she fully expected disappointment. Another wasted hour. Another awkward smile. Another reminder that maybe real connection wasn't meant for her anymore. And then she saw him. He was already there, seated at a corner table by the window, wearing a weathered gray coat. In one hand he held a brown paper bag, and in the other, a takeout coffee. His eyes met hers, and he offered a gentle smile as he stood. "Mallory?" he asked. She gave a small nod. "Yes. And you're?" "Caleb," he said. "I hope it's okay I showed up a bit early." She slid into the seat across from him, setting her purse down carefully. Nothing about him seemed polished. No expensive watch. His hair was slightly damp from the morning dew. His voice, though, was steady, calm in a way that immediately softened the room. "You like to read?" she asked, nodding toward the paperback on the table. "Books have saved me more times than I can count," he replied with a quiet smirk. Mallory smiled slightly, though her guard stayed up. Her last fiancé had also seemed charming, until the mask fell. They ordered drinks. She asked for chamomile tea. "Tea black coffee." "No cream, no sugar." "I like it bitter," he said. "Bitterness," she said, raising an eyebrow, "has to be earned. Kind of like truth." He chuckled. "You're more poetic than I expected." "Hazard of the job," she said. "What do you do exactly?" she asked, testing the waters. "I work with schools," Caleb answered. "Mainly behind the scenes, funding, resources, that sort of thing." It was vague, but not evasive. She let it go. Their conversation paused when he tore a piece from his muffin and leaned slightly toward the window. Outside, a scruffy golden retriever sat by the sidewalk bench, tail wagging with hopeful eyes. Caleb knocked lightly on the glass, opened the door a crack, and dropped the crumb outside. The dog accepted it gently. Mallory blinked. "Unexpected." "He waits here most mornings," Caleb said with a shrug. "He's always hungry. But never greedy." Mallory felt herself smiling before she could stop it. It wasn't much, really. But it was honest. And honesty these days felt rare. In the weeks that followed their first meeting, Mallory found herself returning to Fern and Sons more often than usual. Sometimes she brought along papers to grade. Other times she came just to breathe. But mostly she came because, somehow, Caleb often happened to be there too. He never made a show of it. Always alone. Always with a book in hand. Sometimes scribbling notes into a worn leather journal. Other times simply staring out the window, quietly observing the pace of the world. At first, it seemed like coincidence. Once, twice, maybe 3 times. But by the 5th or 6th encounter, Mallory began to wonder if the universe had a peculiar sense of humor. Or maybe, just maybe, Caleb was giving her space to step closer, without pressure, without expectation. She never asked. And neither did he. One drizzly Tuesday afternoon, as Mallory unfolded her papers at her usual table by the window, she turned to the barista and smiled. "If he comes in today," she said, her voice soft but sure, "let me pay for his coffee." The barista raised an eyebrow. "You mean the guy with the coat that's seen 100 winters and the book that never leaves his hand?" Mallory laughed quietly. "That's the one." Should I write something on the cup? The barista teased. Mallory paused for a second, then shook her head. No message. Just, tell him it's from someone who appreciates quiet company. She never said it out loud, but Caleb's presence had started to bring her peace in a way she didn't quite understand yet. He never flirted. Never pushed. Never asked for more than she was willing to give. And somehow that made her want to give more. One late afternoon, as rain coated the sidewalks and the sky turned a pale gray, Mallory stood outside the cafe waiting for the bus. Her umbrella had broken earlier, and now she stood slightly hunched, coat damp, regretting staying late for a staff meeting. Then came the voice, familiar, warm, and just a little amused. Looks like you could use a small miracle. She turned. Caleb stood beside her, his own umbrella dripping from the rain. He held it out to her without hesitation. Take it, he said. I'll survive. Before she could protest, he stepped back into the rain, the water quickly soaking through his coat. And yet he smiled, wide, unbothered, as if it meant absolutely nothing. It wasn't grand. It wasn't romantic in the traditional sense. But something in her chest tightened. A different kind of ache. The kind that came with being seen, even when you weren't asking to be. A few days later, Mallory's mother mentioned a loose board in the backyard fence. Mallory nodded distractedly, barely registering it. But the next evening, after returning from school, she noticed the panel had been reinforced, new screws, perfectly aligned. Inside the mailbox was a small handwritten note. Loose board fixed. Should last the season. He hadn't mentioned it. Not once. And when she later asked Caleb casually if he'd been by her street, he simply smiled and said, I tend to show up where I'm needed. At Mallory's school, a book drive was underway, donations for underfunded students. She debated for days whether or not to mention it to Caleb. Not because she didn't want him there, but because deep down, she feared he would say no. On Saturday morning, he showed up in faded jeans and a soft flannel shirt, carrying a large cardboard box filled with gently used books. Without fanfare, he unpacked them, sorted them, even helped a shy student pick out his very first novel. When another volunteer asked him what he did for a living, Caleb only smiled and said, I work in education. Just, not in the fancy parts. That same day, as Mallory finished boxing up the last of the donated books, a fellow teacher leaned in close. So, who is he? She whispered. Who? Mallory asked, pretending not to understand. The guy who follows you like a polite shadow. The one who fixes fences in his spare time. Mallory couldn't help but laugh. He just keeps showing up. The teacher tilted her head. Sounds like you don't want him to stop. Mallory didn't answer. She didn't need to. Later that night, curled up on the couch with her dog Max and a mug of hot tea warming her hands, Mallory thought about the little things. The umbrella. The fence. The books. None of them screamed love. But they whispered something just as powerful. There were no grand declarations. No fireworks. Just quiet presence. And maybe, just maybe, that was the kind of love that lasted. Chicken and rice soup, Caleb said simply, lifting the small container from the bag. It didn't look like much. In fact, it seemed a little lumpy. But it was homemade, and Mallory's mother used to swear by its healing powers. Mallory stood in the doorway, her hair a mess, cheeks flushed from fever, and voice nearly gone. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Caleb didn't mention her appearance. He didn't offer pity or overly concerned expressions. He just looked at her with calm eyes and asked, Mind if I come in for a minute? She hesitated but nodded. He stepped inside and placed the food on the kitchen counter. Without asking, he found a clean bowl and gently poured the soup into it, the steam rising in soft spirals. Mallory wrapped herself tighter in her blanket and sank into the couch. She watched him from across the room, his movements so familiar, so gentle, as if this wasn't the first time he had taken care of someone like this. He walked over with the bowl and set it down on her lap. I'll be on the porch, he said quietly, nodding toward the front door. Take your time. Before stepping outside, he reached out and lightly touched her forehead, his fingers brushing against hers for a split second. The contact startled her, and she instinctively pulled back. Sorry, she whispered, embarrassed by the reaction. But Caleb only smiled. "It's okay. I'll be right outside." And he was. After Mallory finished half the soup and her head cleared just enough to think, she shuffled to the front door and peeked out. There he was, sitting on the porch bench, Max at his feet, the leash loosely wrapped around his hand. The dog rested calmly, tail thumping now and then, as if proud of the company they were keeping. Caleb looked like he might doze off any second, but he stayed upright, watching the quiet street. Mallory walked to the kitchen, brewed a small cup of ginger tea, and stepped outside, careful not to let the door creak too loudly. She held out the cup toward him. "I don't know how to say thank you," she said softly. "So I figured this would do for now." Caleb blinked in surprise, then nodded and accepted the cup. "Perfect," he said, his smile small but sincere. For a while, they just sat there in silence. The tea between them warmed the cool night air. No words were necessary. Later that evening, Mallory's mother was resting peacefully in her room. Mallory tucked the blanket around her and returned to her own room, sitting on the edge of her bed, phone in hand. In her photo gallery was a picture she hadn't looked at in almost a year. It was her and her ex-fiancé on what was supposed to be their wedding day. She in a white dress. He in a tailored tuxedo. It lingered there, not because she couldn't let go, but because she hadn't been ready to. Mallory sighed deeply, selected the photo, and deleted it. She didn't even watch it vanish from the screen. She simply put the phone down and looked through the window toward the porch. The empty teacup still sat beside Caleb, and Max had curled up on his lap like a loyal guardian. That night, Mallory lay awake thinking about the man who never asked questions he didn't need answered. A man who listened more than he spoke. A man who showed up when he was needed, without ever having to be asked. She had asked Caleb about his job more than once. Not because she cared about money, God knows she had left that part of her life behind long ago, but because she genuinely wanted to understand the quiet man who had become a constant presence in hers. Each time, his answer was the same. "I work with a foundation that supports schools. Mostly behind the scenes. Nothing glamorous." And each time, she accepted it. She'd learned, sometimes the hard way, that trust wasn't about demanding answers. It was about waiting until someone was ready to give them. One Saturday morning, the two of them decided to stroll through the weekend farmers market just a few blocks from the school where Mallory taught. The air was crisp, early fall just beginning to turn the leaves. The smell of roasted nuts and brewed coffee filled the air. As they walked past a local bookstore booth, Mallory spotted one of her students, Liam, a kind but shy 7th grader, struggling with a worn-out backpack. One of the straps had completely torn. Liam waved quickly and walked ahead, clearly trying to hide his embarrassment. Caleb noticed but said nothing. Later that day, as Mallory browsed through second-hand poetry collections, Caleb politely excused himself. "Be back in 10, he said casually. The following Monday, during lunch, the school principal entered the teacher's lounge carrying a brand-new backpack. "This was left at the front desk this morning," she said. No note, just Liam's name written neatly on the tag. Inside the bag was a small card. For the kid who carries more than just books. No signature. No logo. Just those words. That same afternoon, Mallory found a handwritten thank you note pinned to the staff bulletin board. Liam had written it himself. "To the kind stranger. Thank you for the backpack. I don't know who you are. But I felt seen. I'll remember this. Liam." Mallory didn't need to ask who had left the gift. She knew. Walking home that night, hands buried in her coat pockets, she thought of Caleb. He had never tried to impress her. Never boasted. Never drew attention to himself. And slowly she began to realize, none of this was about being impressive. Every quiet act was just him. He was simply being himself. And for the first time, a quiet question formed in Mallory's heart. If Caleb had nothing, no title, no wealth, no history, would she still think he was the most remarkable man she had ever met? The answer came before she even finished asking it. Yes. Absolutely yes. That weekend, they sat on a bench in the city park, sipping takeaway coffee from a local vendor. Caleb watched a squirrel try to sneak chips from a distracted toddler's snack bag. Mallory noticed too, and they both laughed quietly. "You don't talk about yourself much," she said, her tone gentle, not accusing. Caleb gave a small nod, glancing at her. Feels like the more I say, the more likely I am to say something I'll regret. Mallory tilted her head slightly. Sounds like someone's been hurt before. His gaze dropped for a second, and he exhaled slowly. Haven't we all? She did not push. Instead, she sipped her drink and looked out at the falling leaves. Then, almost as if the words escaped on their own, she said, "If I ever dared to believe in love again, it would be with someone like you." That caught him off guard. He turned toward her with wide, surprised eyes. But she didn't meet his gaze. She smiled faintly at the horizon and added, "Someone who doesn't need to be anybody special to be everything." For the first time in years, Mallory wasn't measuring love by grand gestures or poetic speeches. She was measuring it by the silence between sentences, the ease of sitting side by side, and the quiet kindness of a backpack with no name attached. One chilly Thursday evening, she collapsed into her sofa after a long day, Max curling up beside her. Jazz hummed from the radio in the background. The TV was on, low volume, barely noticeable, until she heard a voice she instantly recognized. Mallory's head snapped up. There he was, Caleb, standing confidently behind a podium, delivering a speech during a live national broadcast. He wore a navy suit. His tone was calm and measured. Behind him, a large banner waved in the wind. National Forum for Advancing Rural Education. "We believe every child, no matter their zip code," he was saying, "deserves a library filled with real books and real hope." The camera zoomed in as he signed an official pledge. $20 million committed to building public libraries in underfunded communities. The text at the bottom of the screen read, "Caleb Monroe, CEO, Monroe Foundation." Mallory's hands trembled as she lowered her untouched tea. Her thoughts stalled, unable to catch up. This was the same man who had mended her mother's fence. The same man who brought soup when she was sick. Who handed out backpacks to kids without ever taking credit. Who sat beside her on porches, never once mentioning what he did or who he was. She turned off the television and sat in complete silence. The next morning, while Mallory sat at her desk between classes, one of her students, Emily, burst in during free period, nearly skipping with excitement. "Miss James," she said breathlessly, "I got a scholarship." Mallory blinked. "What?" Emily nodded rapidly. "The Monroe Foundation. Full ride. Books, supplies, everything. I didn't even apply, it just showed up with a letter." Mallory's stomach dropped. Emily pulled out a small note from her backpack and handed it over. It read simply, "Someone believes in you." There was no name. No signature. Mallory sat frozen in her chair, staring at the card. Puzzle pieces were falling into place so fast it hurt. Anonymous donations. Vague job descriptions. The reluctance to talk about money. She had been staring the truth in the face for weeks and somehow never seen it. And now it felt like it was too late. That evening, she went home without texting Caleb. She let the silence sit between them like a wall she didn't know how to climb. Because he had not lied in words, but he had hidden the truth. He had not trusted her enough to tell her who he really was. That stung worse than any betrayal she had known. She didn't cry. Not that night. She just sat at her kitchen table long after Max had curled up at her feet and fallen asleep, staring at nothing, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. Maybe he thought she wouldn't be able to accept who he was. Maybe he believed she only loved him for what she thought he was, a humble, quiet man with simple intentions. But for a woman who had once been left at the altar by a man full of secrets dressed in $1,000 suits and expensive charm, this new betrayal, the withholding of truth wrapped in kindness, cut deeper than she expected. The next day, she deleted Caleb's number from her phone. Not because she hated him, but because he never gave her the chance to choose him completely. And that was the worst part. He never trusted that she would love the man behind the title. The package arrived the following Friday. A plain, brown envelope tied with string. No return address. Just her name on the front, handwritten in the same neat lettering that made her heart twist. She didn't open it right away. She swept the kitchen floor. Folded the laundry. Walked Max twice. Anything to avoid opening the envelope. It sat on the side table like it was waiting to breathe. But once twilight settled over the quiet little house and the soft hush of evening wrapped itself around the walls, Mallory finally gave in. Her fingers trembled as she untied the string. Inside was a book. Not just any book, her book. Letters to a Young Poet. The same copy she had once lent to Caleb after a quiet talk about poetry beneath the big maple tree outside the cafe. The same one she had tucked a small note into that read, "For when the world feels too loud." Holding her breath, she opened the cover. Tucked inside was a single page of lined paper, folded neatly. The ink was slightly smudged in one corner. She instantly recognized the handwriting, so careful, so precise. A letter. From him. She hesitated. Then read, "Dear Mallory, I've started this letter more times than I can count. I tore each draft up and tried again. Words have never failed me before, until now. You once told me that silence can sometimes be kinder than explanations. But sometimes silence is just fear wearing politeness like a mask. And the truth is, I was afraid. Not of how you'd see me as a CEO, but of whether everything good between us would suddenly feel bought. After everything I've lived through, I didn't know how to believe in love that didn't come with conditions. When I was 27, I lost everything. Not just a business, a house, or peace of mind. The woman I planned to marry left the day the bank froze our accounts. She didn't even look back. That day, I promised myself that if I ever loved again, I'd do it without the armor. No titles. No suits. Just me. And then I met you. You, with your lesson plans stained with tea, your stubborn love for crack-spined books, your quiet loyalty to the things that still matter. To truth. To kindness. To quiet sorrows. You never raised your voice, but somehow you always spoke clearly. And you made me want to do the same. I never wanted to lie. I just wanted to be seen, before I was known. The day you gave me this book, you gave me a piece of your heart. Now I'm giving it back. And if you never want to see me again, I'll understand. But if any part of you still wonders what could have been, I'll be sitting at the place where we first met. Saturday, 10 a.m. No suits. No titles. Just me. Because all I've ever wanted is to be loved when I have nothing. Caleb. By the end, Mallory's eyes blurred with tears. She clutched the book to her chest, holding it as if it could slow the ache in her chest. She didn't change her sweater. She just pulled on a coat, called Max to the door, and stepped out into the early autumn night. To Maple and Company, the little coffee shop where something gentle and true had begun. The next morning, she was already there by 9:45 a.m., sitting quietly at their usual corner table. A cup of tea warmed her palms, but it did little to calm her nerves. She kept telling herself this was just closure. One last page to turn. If he didn't show, she'd move forward. She would. She had to. But when the little bell over the cafe door rang at 10:01, she looked up, and everything stopped. Caleb stepped in from the misty morning chill. He wore the same worn gray coat he had on the very first day they met. In one hand, he held a crumpled brown paper bag, slightly damp from the fog. She already knew what was inside. Max's favorite biscuits. Caleb paused in the doorway for a moment, as if taking it all in. His eyes scanned the cafe like he needed to make sure it hadn't changed. And then he saw her. Their eyes locked. Neither of them smiled, not yet. A silence settled between them. Not awkward but weighty. Full of everything they had not said. A silence that only exists between two people who once meant something real to each other. Fragile, unfinished, but real. He stepped forward, slow and deliberate. When he reached the table, he didn't sit. He stood across from her, hands at his sides, unsure. "I'm not much of a speaker," he began, his voice softer than she remembered. "I probably said too little out loud, and too much in that letter. But if you still want someone who shows up, who won't ask questions you're not ready to answer, I'm here." He set the bag of dog biscuits on the table without breaking eye contact. Mallory looked at him for a long moment. Then she lifted her gaze and met his. She didn't ask why he had kept the truth from her. She didn't question why a man in scuffed boots and flannel could also be the one funding schools and handing out scholarships. She didn't need to. Some truths are clear without explanations. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded, unsure whether he should sit down or walk away. Not knowing if she was thanking him for the letter, the biscuits, or just the fact that he came. But then she added, with a faint smile tugging at her lips, "You don't get to disappear again." His laugh was short, quiet, almost relieved. "That's fair." She pointed to the empty seat across from her. "Then sit down," she said. "You still owe me a proper debate on why Catcher in the Rye is completely overrated." Caleb slowly pulled out the chair and sat. For a moment, they said nothing, just existed in the warmth of second chances. Then he grinned. "Only if you agree to defend Jane Eyre with all your literary passion." Mallory always raised one eyebrow when she was about to disagree, but never harshly. That's how Caleb knew, without needing words, that they were okay. That maybe, just maybe, the bridge wasn't burned. There it was again. That gentle rhythm. The quiet comfort of someone who knew how to speak without noise. The kind of warmth that settled into a person's chest, expanding gently until it felt like home. Outside, Max sat patiently by the cafe window, his tail wagging softly against the sidewalk as if he too had been waiting for this. And inside, two people who once stood on the edge of something beautiful, then lost it, were now quietly seated again. No labels. No promises. No fairy tale endings. Just a second chance, offered with no conditions attached. 1 year later, their home was a small white house at the end of a quiet street in a modest town. Not grand. No gates, no marble countertops, no fountains. But there was a garden, wild and joyful, planted by Mallory and her mother, full of daisies, lavender, and bright yellow poppies. A wooden fence wrapped gently around it, the same fence Caleb had built by hand that spring. Beneath the old oak tree, a pair of ropewood swings creaked gently in the breeze. Every morning, without fail, Caleb and Mallory sat together on their front porch, 2 mugs resting between them on a little weathered table. No phones. No distractions. Just the sound of birds, the murmur of the town waking up, and the laughter of children from the elementary school across the street. The school itself was only 6 months old, built on land anonymously donated and entirely funded by the Monroe Foundation. Nobody in the neighborhood knew that the same man who quietly helped kids cross the street in the morning was the one whose name was carved into the cornerstone of the school library. Caleb liked it that way. He wore flannel shirts now. Sometimes forgot to shave for days. He grew tomatoes in raised garden beds. Burned toast at least once a week. And once, painted right over the light switch without noticing. Mallory teased him constantly and loved him more each day. Inside, her mother, now healthy and strong again, folded laundry at the window, humming along to soft jazz playing from an old record player they had found during one of their weekend date thrift store hunts. Max barked joyfully in the yard, chasing a butterfly like he was still a puppy, not a 10-year-old dog with graying whiskers and soulful eyes. Mallory's writing desk sat by the front window now, drenched in morning sun. That's where she graded essays and scribbled thoughts into her worn leather journal. On the desk, beside a pencil mug and a tin of bookmarks, stood a framed letter. The letter. The first one Caleb ever wrote her. The one he had sent with her old book. The paper was soft now, creased from being reread too many times. The ink had faded slightly, but the words hadn't lost their weight. Below it, handwritten in his looping, unmistakable script, was a single line. She loved me when I had nothing. So now I give her everything, starting with my heart. It was the only thing she ever put on display that made her feel proud just by glancing at it. A photograph sat beside it, the two of them at the first school book drive, smiling like people who finally understood what home meant. Not a place. A person. One quiet Thursday morning, while the birds chirped and the coffee steamed, Mallory folded the local newspaper and looked across the porch at Caleb. "Another student got a scholarship," she said. He raised his mug. "That's the 3rd one this month." "You really won't let them put your name on the grant packets, will you?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. He shook his head slowly, a soft smile touching his lips. "I don't need the whole world to know. Just you." She reached across the table and touched his hand. "But I need to know." He lifted her fingers to his lips and pressed a kiss against her knuckles. Then that's enough for me. The screen door creaked open behind them. Mallory's mom stepped out, holding a tray of warm cinnamon rolls she had baked that morning. Max barked proudly, trotting across the grass with a long stick in his mouth like he had just saved the planet. Caleb stood up and helped her mom with the tray, still that same careful soul she met under the red maple tree. Life didn't look like the dream Mallory once imagined. It looked better. It didn't come with white dresses and perfect scripts. It came with mismatched mugs, porch sunrises, unspoken loyalty, and a love that didn't need to be declared to be understood. And in that small corner of the world, two people, once broken by fear, silence, and loss, found their way to something whole. Not loud, not showy, just real, honest, quite beautiful. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, leave a comment, and share the video with your friends. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next story. Your support keeps these moments alive.